Greetings everyone and welcome to Frihetsnytt with me, Victor Eriksson. And with us here today, all the way from over to the Lost Colonies, or the United States of America as some might call it, we have none other than Colonel Douglas Macgregor with us here today. Very welcome, Colonel.
Hey, thanks very much. Happy to be here. And by the way, I'm originally from Philadelphia, and
Philadelphia.
my first ancestor stepped off the boat in 1681. It was a Quaker from Great Britain, and this is my mother's family. And interestingly enough, we have a church in Philadelphia called Old Swedes Church
Hmm.
because the Swedes had already been there for decades when we arrived.
Yeah, I know about the history, and we also have something here in Sweden, I think, called Philadelphia kyrkan, a reference to the old free church evangelicals that I think came back from the United States. But
Yeah.
doesn't your family come from have any ancestry from Scotland, considering the name Macgregor?
Oh no, it's my father's family is 100% Scottish. My mother's family was more than half Scottish, but we do have some Welsh and Irish impurities,
Mhm.
but not too many.
Completely Celtic, completely British. But what
So,
we're going to talk about here today is what has been happening with President Donald Trump, the escalating conflict with Iran, the influence of Israel over US politics, and also the growing anti-war movement within the MAGA movement within in the United States. But before we get started, Colonel, could you please give us a little bit of introduction over your history and your context with President Trump?
well, I've written 5 books, all of them on military affairs concerned with the American military. That's my background, military and foreign policy. And I served in 1991 in the Army. At the time, I was in the lead element of the 7th Corps, 42 tanks, 42 Bradleys, 8 guns, and we ended up in something called the Battle of 73 Easting, which we fought through. I ended up being asked to come into the Trump administration in the first term at the end of President Trump's administration. And he made me the senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense and asked me to try and extricate us from Afghanistan, which I did. But ultimately, it fell apart because there was so much opposition to disengagement from Afghanistan in the Senate and the House, but particularly the Senate, and he bowed to the pressure there.
Mhm.
But one thing I can say about President Trump, regardless of what happens, is I know that he is someone who is opposed to war,
Mhm.
very much so, does not want to bring the United States into conflict if he can avoid it.
Mhm. But
Question is, can he avoid it?
Mhm. But yeah, a little bit around about 1.5 weeks ago, he decided to join the Israeli war on Iran and contributed with an attack, American attack against Iranian soil. Were you surprised when that happened?
Yes and no. There are a couple of things to keep in mind. First of all, the Israelis had approached him and asked for a ceasefire because Israel was in a very, very bad shape. They had taken an enormous beating from the Iranians, from their missile arsenal. In fact, Ben-Gvir, who's part of the inner circle, made a statement when he didn't know that he was being overheard or recorded. He was asked, "Well, why have you turned to the Americans after only a few days and looking for American help to end the conflict?" He said, "Well, we did not appreciate or understand the Iranian missile arsenal. We just didn't appreciate it." In other words, they were being overwhelmed. They couldn't stop it. The second part of it was then Smotrich, who is a gentleman also in the inner circle, who was speaking on the financial condition in the Knesset, and he said in the meeting, "We've got another week, maybe 2 weeks before our economy entirely collapses and implodes." So I think at that point, President Trump was obviously going to act to try and extricate Israel from this situation. And I think he also looked at the potential to attack and strike these targets where the Israelis had alleged, or the Iranians, excuse me, had allegedly developed nuclear material for civil use And of course, we always had insisted that that was not really acceptable, although we had been negotiating with them and led them to believe that limited enrichment would be acceptable. And then while this was going on, our so-called negotiations, Israel launched a surprise attack.
mm,
This destroyed our credibility because obviously we knew this was coming. And I think President Trump said, well, the cat is out of the bag. We're a co-belligerent anyway, and decided to go after these sites. Now, the interesting part is that he actually called Iran and told them, we're going to strike these sites at least 2 hours before we did it. Now, this went through, I suppose, the Swiss embassy or somebody else like that. But the point is that he really didn't want to kill anybody. Secondly, after we've looked at these strikes, and a lot of people have looked at this, they've discovered that apparently whatever we thought was there was not really there. And whatever was there was not terribly meaningful. And we're not even sure what was supposedly destroyed, because normally, if you penetrate into the inner sanctum of the nuclear development, you get radiation. In other words, it escapes and you can detect it.
mm,
None has been detected. So now people are increasingly convinced that whatever was important in these sites was removed,
mm.
probably weeks before we even struck them.
And do you
Now,
think?
Did
Oh, sorry.
President Trump know that? I have no idea.
Mm,
But I think what he did is he struck these. He then, and remember that he told the Iranians we were coming, that we were going to hit these sites, nothing else, and that was it. So the Iranians did not launch any air defense missiles against us. And then the next day, the Iranians said they were going to strike Bahrain, our military installations there. They told us that they were coming and they were going to do this. And of course, they knew that we had already evacuated everyone from Bahrain.
mm,
So you have this sort of quid pro quo between the two sides. Well, this is vintage President Trump. He
mm,
doesn't want to kill anybody. And he did this a few years ago in his first term twice with cruise missile strikes into Syria.
mm,
And he called in advance, said what he was going to do, hit nothing, changed nothing, declared victory, and stopped. I think President Trump was trying to do the same thing. He's like too many Americans, I think, in one sense. He wants to bomb in the morning and then send sandwiches and coffee over in the afternoon and make peace in the evening.
mm,
Now, you and I know things don't work that way. So we're at war with Iran, whether we like it or not. Now,
mm,
let there be no mistake about it. And for all intents and purposes, the Russians know that we are a co-belligerent in Ukraine.
mm. And do you think Iran is developing nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction, as they were calling it in Iraq 20 years ago?
No. And I think we have on record now Mr. Netanyahu, starting in 1995, telling everybody as often as he could, Iran is 2 months from a nuclear weapon.
Mm,
Iran is 1 month from a nuclear weapon.
mm,
Iran is 2 weeks from a nuclear weapon. Iran is now hours from a nuclear weapon. You know, you could go on and on and on. I don't think that the Iranians ever really wanted a nuclear weapon.
mm,
I think that's pretty clear. Now, what will happen as a result of this? That's anybody's guess. I mean, quite frankly, you have to remember that if you look at North Korea, North Korea has a nuclear weapon. No one will attack North Korea. So all North Korea has to do is sit on the nuclear weapon. Now there's Libya, and we persuaded Muammar Gaddafi in Libya to give up any nuclear weapons, to shut down any work in biological or chemical weaponry. He agreed. And we told him if he did this, he'd be welcomed into the family of nations. All sanctions would be lifted. He did it. What happened to him?
mm.
They killed
Torture to
him,
death.
and we bombed the place. So you can make the argument that the lesson is North Korea.
Mm,
So at this point, what will Iran do? I don't know.
mm,
But I'm sure there are people saying, look, if we want to survive and not be attacked by the United States and Israel, we can't sit here naked without a nuclear capability.
mm. And I think about what you mentioned earlier about the Israeli situation. If the United States hadn't joined and attacked Iran as well, you said more or less that the Israeli economy would collapse. Would that be really be the case if Trump hadn't decided to attack Iran? And what would have happened with Netanyahu and the Likud government?
I think another week and Israel would have been very close to total collapse. 10 more days and they would have been finished. Remember, Israel is a very small country. It's smaller than the state of New Jersey in the United States. Iran is the size of Western Europe with 92 million people. Israel has an estimated 9 million, of which 2 million are Arabs. So that gives you 7 million Jews. It's not it doesn't make any sense. I mean, why would you attack a nation the size of Iran? But I think they did that with the full knowledge that they have us at their beck and call, that we unconditionally support whatever they want to do. So that's where we are right now. Now, what's happened since then is it will take Israel, certainly, I would think, 90 to 120 days, maybe longer, to restore their arsenal of air and missile defense weapons. In fact, I don't know if they can even do it in that time frame, and that means they're dependent upon us. We produce about 660 Patriot missiles a year. You'll go through that arsenal in maybe 2 days, 3 days, because you tend to shoot two missiles at every incoming missile. So they're not going to last very long. Our missile arsenal is reached a point now where to continue with missile barrages anywhere right now, we're really putting ourselves at risk if we have to fight a peer competitor. Now, there's no real danger of war breaking out between us and Russia or us and China unless we provoke it. But my point is that the arsenal is down. The numbers of missiles are down. And so there's an interest on our side in also a pause, if you will. Plus the fact you got to remember that we've kept a lot of these sailors overseas on these ships for a long time, and they need a break.
Mhm. And but what would happen with Israel if, say, the European Union is now starting to speak more and more about sanctions against individual Israeli politicians, Israeli settlers? What would happen if the European Union, for example, I don't know about the United States, would decide upon massive economic sanctions against Israel? Nothing, not really exactly as big as against Russia, but still economic sanctions. What would happen then, considering a lot of Israeli trade goes between them and Europe?
Well, remember that the policy of exterminating the population of Gaza continues. That has not changed. Mr. Netanyahu does enjoy strong support in Israel for anything that either kills or expels the Arab population from Gaza. For that matter, they're doing things on the West Bank now. Just within the last 48 hours, 72 hours, a village of Christian Palestinians was completely destroyed. The population was driven out. All the homes were burned to the ground. So this is not changing. They want to expel the Arabs from Israeli soil. I don't know that unless that changes, there will be an end to the war. Now, the only state that has successfully resisted Israeli and American domination and hegemony is Iran. The Turks have chosen to cooperate with it for their own reasons. They've gotten control of Syria, even though that's another, I think, stain on the honor of the American people, what has happened in Syria. And there are things happening now in the Caucasus that are very dangerous, but it suggests that the war continues with other means. And we can talk about that if you want.
Yeah, we'll definitely have a moment to do so. But I was quite curious about the negotiations between Russia and Ukraine that more or less failed. Trump promised that he would bring an end to the war, but it still goes on. Does the failure to reach a peace agreement, did it affect the decision to help Israel, for example, or put more focus in the Middle East from the US side?
Well, the United States essentially an announcement from the Department of Defense just came out saying that we are suspending any more deliveries of missiles and munitions to Ukraine. We can't afford to send anything. We need them for our own potential use, and I imagine that a lot of this will go to CENTCOM, the Central Command, which is where Israel is located. So that's very clear that for all intents and purposes, I think President Trump has now walked away from events in Ukraine. Making the statement that he did was a very stupid thing to do. As a European, these matters are very complex. You don't wave your wand and magically change everything into peace. Ukraine is a complex place. The history there is very, very difficult for Americans to even begin to understand. And I think he finally said, well, I can't do much about it, so we'll stop talking about it. That's not unusual for us. When we were soundly defeated strategically in Vietnam and we left, people didn't even know we had left. We just stopped talking about Vietnam, and the media was compliant and cooperated with the government and said, fine, we won't talk about Vietnam anymore. It was an embarrassment. The next time we heard about Vietnam was when Saigon fell and the communists seized power there. So I think you're going to have something similar in Ukraine. I think the Russians are simply going to complete the task. That no one knows how this will happen, but I think they'll end up crossing the river, go to Kiev, probably take Odessa. And then the Europeans are going to be faced with a fait accompli. And we're going to tell the Europeans, look, this is your problem. You have to handle it.
Mhm.
So I think that's what will happen there. And now he's focused on the Middle East, and he doesn't want a war there. But this is out of his control because nothing's changed inside Israel. The Israelis are still committed to the destruction of Iran and the annihilation of the population in Gaza.
Mhm. Mhm. But let's say that Russia is able to defeat Ukraine in a close future, and considering their close connections, diplomatic connections with Iran, if they decide, think that the business is done in Ukraine, let's focus on the Middle East, considering that Iran is the last country where they have a major influence, how will Russia react if the war escalates?
Russia and China have both decided that Iran's survival intact is a vital strategic interest for both of those countries. Iran's independence and its survival within the broad framework of what China and Russia are trying to achieve in Eurasia with the One Belt, One Road, the various commercial and transportation infrastructure projects that are going on, that of which Iran is a very important part, that they cannot allow under any circumstances Iran to be destroyed. So I think that's a foregone conclusion. They will fight to prevent that in whatever way they can. President Trump allegedly was overheard telling the Iranian foreign minister, "You should have, you should have let us help you before this last 12-day war occurred." And apparently, the statement was, "Well, the Iranians wanted to do this on their own," and President Bush said, "That's fine, but you still should have asked us." I think you're going to see more intrusive Russian assistance, particularly in the areas of integrated air defense and air defense missiles. At the same time, the Chinese have now promised 127 of their most modern jet aircraft. 40 are supposedly already on the ground or coming. I think you're going to see massive influx of Chinese aid and assistance there as well. Now, all of this happens at a point in time where President Aliyev of Azerbaijan has indicated that he wants to attack and seize portions of Armenia, but he also wants to move into Iran on the pretext that northern Iran is inhabited by large numbers of Muslim Turks. Most of them are Shiite, but nevertheless, they're Azeri Turks. He aspires to a greater Azerbaijan, just as Israel aspires to a greater Israel. Now, this is not going down well in Russia at all because the Russians aren't interested in seeing Aliyev try to dismember Iran. Now, I don't know what the true state of affairs is right now on the ground in northern Iran, but historically, the Azeri Turks, who are Shiites who live in northern Iran, have been fully integrated into Persian society and Persian culture and civilization. They are by no means second-class citizens or mistreated in any way. In fact, they serve in the government, and the Ayatollah himself descends from the same stock of those people in northern Iran. But it's interesting to me, and I think to anybody who looks at the region, that what we see emerging is this same strategy that failed against Russia in Ukraine, emerging now against Iran. In other words, Syria is now firmly in the hands of Sunni Islamists, people who were formerly with ISIS and Al Qaeda, but are reporting to Erdogan and Turkey. So Syria is now in an anti-Shiite camp, as well as an anti-Christian, anti-Western camp. That seems to suit both Israel and Turkey. At the same time, you have Aliyev, who wants to march into northern Iran and essentially dismember the northern portion of Iran. I don't know that this will work. It has failed miserably against Russia. Russia is stronger than it's ever been. It hasn't been dismembered. Its military is powerful. I don't think the Russians are going to let this happen. And I think the Russians will intervene in whatever way they deem necessary. But we know that Aliyev offered Azerbaijan as a base of operation to Mossad to launch strikes, drones, and other things into Iran. So Mossad, the CIA, MI6 are very active in Azerbaijan, active in Syria, active inside Iran, all with the goal of doing to Iran what did not happen to Russia.
Mhm. A lot of neoconservatives in both the United States, but also here in Europe, are talking about a regime change in Iran and that these ballistic robot attacks against Iran might contribute to a big revolt, an overchange or overthrow of the Iranian government. Would that really be possible? And if that did happen, what would be the consequences?
Well, I think it's unlikely to work, but Iran is not Russia. It's not as tightly integrated, nor is it as powerful a state as the Russian state. But nevertheless, I think it is unlikely. The test case, of course, will be what happens in northern Iran with the Azeri Turks living inside Iranian society and nation. Uh, if it were to happen, then this would, of course, from the standpoint of the United States, disrupt the One Belt, One Road, the transportation, communications infrastructure, the north-south line that runs basically from the Indian Ocean up through Iran, across the Caucasus, into Russia and Ukraine. These lines are part of the larger commercial integration and transportation integration of the Eurasian landmass. We seem to regard that as a threat to our interests, so we're trying to do everything we can to disrupt it and make it fail. Uh, Again, I don't think that will work. There are limits to what you can do as a maritime power, and we are ultimately a maritime and naval power. In other words, we live remote from these places. We don't live in the Eastern Hemisphere. We live in the Western Hemisphere. And then finally, there is a very, very serious financial situation here in the United States. I'm sure people in Sweden have followed the commentary by Elon Musk
Mhm.
about this so-called bill that we've just passed that is probably putting us on the road to financial Armageddon sooner rather than later. You've got the Secretary of the Treasury is very concerned about the bond market and preventing that from imploding. You have the head of the Federal Reserve, Mr. Powell, who's worried about interest rates. Things could get out of control very, very quickly here in the United States financially. Uh, we're on fragile ground. So none of us can predict with absolute certainty, but I think Nassim Taleb, the man who coined the term black swan, said something that's very important. He said the new reserve currency is now gold, not the dollar. The dollar is no longer the store of value it once was. And what we see happening with BRICS and around the world is a gradual but steady de-dollarization.
Mhm.
So you have to look at all of these factors and then ask, what do you think will happen? I think there are limits to what we can achieve.
Mhm. We're gonna move from speaking about the politics in the Middle East to move on to the American U.S. Internal domestic politics and the influence of Israeli power in America. But I just want to turn towards our dear viewers just for a little bit. If you really like what we do here at Frihetsnytt and you want to support us, we I really appreciate all the kind of donations and gifts we can get from you. No matter if it's cash, if you hand it over to us personally, but also via Swish, which you can send to our number 123 519 6373 in Swedish, 123 519 6373. But Colonel, in an interview you did with Daniel Davis about more than a week ago, you spoke about the Israeli influence in the United States politics. How big would you say that the Israeli and Zionist influence is?
I think that the influence of the Israel lobby, thanks to the billionaires that contribute to it inside the United States, is enormous. They're very open about it. They joke that they can deliver the Senate and the House on anything of importance to them, that is the Israel lobby. MAGA is increasingly, instead of being called Make America Great Again, is now being called MEGA, Make Israel Great Again. And people are going back to the Republican convention last year, and they are seeing once again this giant Israeli flag on the wall with a poster above it saying, Make Israel Great Again, or Israel First. And you have this man that comes out and speaks in front of it. I don't know who he is. And he says, Israel First, and tries to lead cheers for it. I think a lot of Americans saw that, were bewildered by it, didn't pay much attention to it. Now that's being recycled, and people are realizing, my God, that was real. And that's the way Trump is being viewed by his so-called base. Now, what difference does that make in the short run? None. Doesn't make any difference at all. Either you are in power or you are not. And the people that are unhappy with this are not in power. And what we learned when Biden was there is that the overwhelming majority of the American electorate was not comfortable with the admission of 20 to 30 million people illegally into the United States, opening the borders and letting anybody in who wanted to come in.
Mm.
But there was nothing we could do about it because we were not in power. So that situation has been rectified somewhat. It's been slowed down. We still don't have control of our borders and coastal waters the way we need to. We still have drugs and human trafficking coming through. But the point is, at least millions are not pouring in. Right now, we have no control or influence as Americans whatsoever on anything that happens with our foreign and defense policy. We don't control our own defense establishment. That lives at the beck and call of the president and Congress, but primarily the president. And right now, it will unconditionally support whatever Israel wants. Now, if things should go badly, then everything could change. Most Americans pay very little attention to what happens beyond the borders of their country until American soldiers, sailors, airmen, or Marines are killed,
Mhm.
until their standard of living somehow or another is jeopardized.
Mhm.
Their lives are disrupted. Then they pay attention. But until that happens, I don't think it makes much difference what happens with MAGA.
Mm.
Uh, it just doesn't matter.
Mm. But we don't only don't only have the big influence of the Israeli lobby or individual Jewish billionaires influencing Trump. We also have this very big evangelical Christian Zionist movement who views Israel's strength and Israel's interest as something related to the return of Christ. How big would you say that movement is, and how can they justify supporting Israel while at the same time seeing that they attack Christians in Palestine and the harassments against Christians in Israel?
Well, that constitutes about 30 million people in the electorate, uh, and they all voted, obviously, for President Trump. I'm told that too is weakening substantially. How much, I have no idea. It's anybody's guess. So I think the takeaway for you looking at the United States right now is number one, what happens to us financially and economically? We are on very fragile ground. The British Empire in 1947 had a debt to GDP ratio of 240%. That's when they left India. Our debt to GDP ratio is over 120% and rising. And I think that's going to continue. What is the breaking point? No one really knows. What happens overseas is important insofar as it affects us here at home. If our supply chains are disrupted and the standard of living falls precipitously, that will have an impact. And we already know that the underclass has grown. You know, in the United States, about 60% of the population 10 years ago, 15 years ago was quote unquote middle class. Today it's below 50%, which means that the underclass has risen substantially. At the same time, the top 1% and the top 10% have grown infinitely richer. But the people that work for a living, they're not seeing more money, not more income. So, any sudden change that worsens these conditions could have a profound impact on what we do or don't do.
Mhm.
And I would watch that if I were sitting in Europe right now.
Mhm. And how does, do you know how Trump personally views Israel? How much he's playing along with their politics, or if he's trying to just placate them enough so that he can do whatever he wants? And what are the attitudes towards Israel from the people around him, like Vice President Vance, Pete Hegseth, Marco Rubio, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and Tulsi Gabbard?
Well, I can't speak for Tulsi. I would simply say everyone that surrounds him, that he listens to, his inner circle, is very solidly in the Israeli camp.
Hmm.
I would not expect anything to reach President Trump that contradicts anything that Israel wants, and that includes intelligence, everything. I think he's fully captured in that sense when it comes to Israel and Israel's interests. What does he think privately? Well, he made the decision to accept billions of dollars in support of his campaign. He would not be in the White House without the money that stems from the Israel lobby and its supporters in the United States.
Mhm. And what is the general population's view in America towards Israel? And what do people know about the attack on the USS Liberty and the fact that Israel got their hands on nuclear bombs by stealing plans from the United States?
Most Americans don't know about those things. Only a few do. Uh, Americans are alarmed now by the outsized influence, disproportionate influence that the Israel lobby has. I think more are alarmed by the new laws in some states, as well as on the federal level, that deal with anti-Semitism, that convey the impression that Americans who are Jewish are part of a separate privileged class that cannot be challenged. I think that's beginning to have an impact. But does this really make any difference to the larger picture? I don't think so. Again, you're talking about a big country. You've got 340 million, and you've got probably 150 to 160 million adults, and they're very worried in most cases about putting food on the table. I don't know of very many people who want a war with anyone, anywhere. In fact, you could make that argument. We were overwhelmingly opposed to entering World War I, but we were dragged into it by a president that found ways to do that. And at the time, he was influenced by the banks and specifically Great Britain. World War II, everyone was opposed to involving ourselves in the war in Europe. And if we had not hoodwinked the Japanese into attacking us, I don't think we would have fought in the Second World War. I mean, we could go down the list. Americans, the first time Americans really bought the notion that we should fight somewhere, I think was in 1965. And people were very concerned about the spread of communism. And they bought the argument that we were going there to fight communism. Of course, in retrospect, that was ridiculous. That was a civil war. Communism had a very modest role to play, but people believed it. And since then, I think we've tried to fight wars on the cheap. That's one of the reasons we abandoned the draft. We did not want to be hostage. That is, the people in Washington didn't want to be hostage to public opinion if you had a draft force that involved average citizens who might be killed. So here we sit many years later, and the lesson of the 20th century for many people was if you don't disturb the American people, then you can pretty much do whatever you want. That's the lesson after 1965. If you start showing losses on television every night, people are being killed, the support for your operation is going to dwindle. Therefore, after Vietnam, you go to the so-called all-volunteer force. So if you can keep the economy afloat, not much is going to happen. Now, the last time we were in a position we are now, which is close to default, was under Nixon's administration when we went off the gold standard. That was effectively a default, but people didn't understand that at the time. It was an evasion of consequences. There's no way to evade the consequences now.
Mhm. But we also have this growing movement within the MAGA movement that opposes war and opposes the war rhetorics and the war hysteria. And I was thinking mostly about Tucker Carlson, but also other characters and profiles as well. How big would you say the movement is? And would you say it grows more and more, and that Trump has and the administration has underestimated how big it can be?
It's not organized. And even though if you were to stop most people most of the time on the street, they would say, yeah, I think we should get out of that. I think we shouldn't do that. It doesn't make any difference. I hate to be blunt with you, but it's back to what I said at the beginning. We're not in power. The people in power make the decisions. They're going to do what they want to do. If they overreach, and I think we came close to that recently in this war between Iran and Israel, and I think President Trump would privately acknowledge that we've overreached and the Israelis overreached. If we go back to that, and we could very easily, I mean, this war is not over. You could see something along the lines of what you're describing, a groundswell of opposition that then induces change in government. That's what happened in 1968. That's why Nixon became president in 69. But right now, I would say no. It's not nearly as significant as you may think. Despite, and there are many of us, I have always been very opposed to these interventions, certainly since I saw the decision to occupy Iraq, which I thought was a terrible mistake and totally unnecessary. And from there on out, it's just gotten steadily worse. So I think there are lots of us that feel that way. It doesn't make any difference. We're not in power. Nobody is listening to us. There are no billionaires backing us. And in Washington, it's all about money. Follow the money.
Mhm. The final question for this interview is, you said it's open for guessing what will happen next. But what do you think will happen? Will it escalate into a full-scale war? Do you think the United States will intervene fully in Iran with boots on the ground? And how will it affect NATO, for example? Because it would be an American attack and not an attack on America that would put Article 5 into effect. What do you think would happen, and what would the consequences be?
The the real question is what happens first. If the financial implosion occurs between now and I would say November, then all bets are off. It will be so severe. The conditions in this country will unravel quickly. Our societal cohesion is not very strong. And when that occurs, we will turn inward immediately to deal with the problems here. Now, if that doesn't happen first, you could get the escalation. Knows how that would occur.
I think it
You know,
froze a little
I
bit,
remember
Colonel. Could you please repeat that for the past 10 seconds? I think you froze a bit.
oh, okay. I think it all depends on whether or not the financial crisis that we anticipate comes sooner or later. If it happens between now and November, it will be so severe. Our position economically will be so seriously weakened. Our internal uh, condition will be one of unrest and massive discontent. That would interrupt the whole process and prevent us from launching into a major war, I suspect. On the other hand, if it doesn't happen between now and November, if it is postponed yet again in a flood of cash that's printed or published or whatever, then I think you could see something that could launch us into a full-scale escalation. But nobody knows what the trigger would be for that. You know, Bismarck on his deathbed made the comment. They said, do you think, he was asked a question, do you think what you've done will work and we can avoid a war? He said, we can unless some damn fool in the Balkans does something. Well, he was right. We don't know what can happen with the Israelis. We don't know what can happen in the Middle East and the Caucasus. We just can't be certain. We don't know how people will react or respond. And we don't know what will happen here. So, bottom line is anything is possible. And I wish I could give you a better answer, but I just can't.
Well, it's a pretty good answer still. A better guess than most people would provide. So thank you very much, Colonel Douglas Macgregor, for being with us here today. Do you have any final words for our audience here in Sweden?
Rethink NATO because NATO is a facade. It's not serious. Rethink this assumption, all of your assumptions about Russia. Put aside your history with Russia and think instead of what really is happening there. Start asking hard questions. Don't vote mindlessly for the same people. What's killing us in the West is this conformity of thinking about everything, not enough questioning. See Russia as it is, not as people are telling you it is. Russia is not the great enemy for which we need to arm and fight. On the other hand, we all have problems inside our countries, problems with criminality, lawlessness, mass immigration that must be reversed. Those are the things that we need to focus on here in the United States and you in Europe.
Mm,
Okay?
definitely. And I hope our viewers take this to heart, considering that we have a parliament election here in Sweden in 2026. Again, thank you very much, Colonel, for being with us here today. It was a great pleasure and a great honor as well. And I hope we'll get to see you here on the channel more times in the future.
Enjoy your vacation in Gotland.
I'll try to do this, sir. And thank you very much to all of you who have seen this interview. Remember to follow us at frihetsnytt.se, but also at Rumble. I'll see you at next time.